cast aside by her family into a nursing home, she vowed to show them all. This is the incredible true-to-life story of how one forgotten mother not only reclaimed her dignity, but found an inspiring new purpose that changed lives. They call this place Golden Meadows Retirement Villa. Golden Meadows. Sounds like something out of a fairy tale, doesn't it? A place where old folks like me are supposed to gently fade into the sunset, surrounded by manicured lawns and watercolor paintings of tranquil lakes. Let me tell you, there's nothing golden about it, and the only meadows I see are the ones in my fading memories of a life that feels like it belonged to someone else. My name is Agnes. I'm 78 years young, or old, depending on which side of the locked door you're standing on. And this villa is my gilded cage, courtesy of my one and only daughter, Caroline. She said I was too old a burden, her exact words. They echo in my head day and night, a cruel soundtrack to the sterile silence of this room. A burden. After all the years I dedicated to her, all the sacrifices Frank, God rest his soul, and I had made. A burden. Just like that. 50 years of motherhood, of love and worry and scraped knees and bedtime stories, reduced to a 5-word dismissal. And then she locked me away. Not literally with a key she turned in a lock. No, Caroline was always too clever for anything so crude. She did it with doctor's reports she'd coaxed out of a geriatric specialist who'd seen me for all of 15 minutes, with tearful pronouncements to her spineless husband, Michael, about her failing mother needing professional care, with a mountain of paperwork signed with a flourish while I was still reeling from the effects of a mild sedative she'd insisted I take for my nerves. Nerves. Oh, I had nerves all right. The nerves of a woman watching her own child systematically dismantle her life, her independence, her very identity, all with a smile as sweet as arsenic, and a voice dripping with false concern. "It's for your own good, Mama," she'd cooed, patting my hand, the one that still bore the faint indentation of Frank's wedding band, a ring Caroline had once admired, but now probably saw as just another piece of an old woman's clutter. It all started, or at least the final act of this tragedy did, about 6 months after my little fall. I'd tripped over the rug in my own living room, the one Caroline had always said was a tripping hazard, as if predicting her own future justifications. A fractured hip. Painful, yes. Debilitating for a while, certainly. But not a death sentence. Not a reason to be declared incompetent and carted off like a piece of unwanted furniture. I was recovering, doing my exercises, even starting to cook for myself again in my small, sunny kitchen, in the house Frank and I had bought when Caroline was just a freckle-faced tomboy. It was my home, my sanctuary, filled with memories, with the scent of Frank's old books and the faint aroma of the roses he used to grow in the backyard. But Caroline saw her opening. She and Michael had been eyeing my house for years. "Such a big place for just one person, Mama," she'd say, her voice a little too bright. "And all that upkeep. You should downsize, move into something more manageable." Manageable for whom, I always wondered. For me, or for her and Michael, who were always complaining about their cramped apartment and the rising cost of real estate? The fall was the excuse she needed. Suddenly, I was frail, confused, unable to care for myself. She'd swoop in with Michael in tow, rearranging my furniture for safety, bringing in casseroles I didn't want, speaking to me in that slow, loud voice people use for children and idiots. She started talking about my options. Assisted living. A lovely little community. And then, Golden Meadows. "It's top of the line, Mama," she'd gushed, showing me glossy brochures filled with smiling, silver-haired seniors engaged in suspiciously vigorous activities. "They have everything there. Doctors on call, planned activities, gourmet meals. You won't have to worry about a thing." Worry? I was worried sick. Worried about losing my home, my independence, the last vestiges of the life Frank and I had built. I told her no. I told her I was fine. I told her I wanted to stay in my own house. Her smile tightened then. The concern in her eyes turned flinty. Mama, we've discussed this. The doctors agree. It's what's best. We've already made a deposit. A deposit? On my life, without my consent. The day they came for me, I fought. Not physically. What could a 78-year-old woman with a healing hip do against her determined daughter and that silent, complicit lump of a son-in-law? I fought with words, with tears, with a dignity I tried desperately to cling to. Caroline, you can't do this, I pleaded, as she packed a small suitcase with a few of my clothes, her movements efficient, impersonal. This is my home, Frank's home. It's for the best, Mama, she repeated, her voice devoid of emotion now, her eyes avoiding mine. You'll be safe here, cared for. Safe, like a prized poodle in a velvet-lined kennel. They drove me here, to Golden Meadows. The lobby was all hushed tones and ersatz elegance. The room they showed me was small, sterile, with a view of a meticulously manicured, utterly soulless courtyard. It smelled of floor wax and resignation. Caroline hugged me at the door, a brief, brittle embrace. I'll visit soon, Mama. Get settled in. Try the Tuesday bingo. I hear it's a hoot. And then she was gone, leaving me standing in the middle of that beige room, my small suitcase at my feet, the echo of her false cheer ringing in my ears. Locked away. That's what it felt like. No bars on the windows, no guards at the door, but a prison nonetheless. A prison of soft voices, scheduled activities, and the crushing weight of other people's good intentions, all orchestrated by the daughter who thought I was a burden. Well, maybe I am old. Maybe I am a burden in her shiny, fast-paced world. But I'm not dead yet. And I'm not stupid. Caroline thinks she's won, thinks she's neatly tucked me away while she and Michael figure out what to do with my house, my savings, my life. She's in for a surprise, because this old burden has a few tricks left up her sleeve. They locked me away all right, but they have no idea what they've just unleashed. I will show them all. Frank didn't raise a quitter, and I didn't raise Caroline to be. This. Something went wrong with her, and maybe, just maybe, it's not too late to show her the error of her ways, or at least, to reclaim what's mine. My dignity, if nothing else. The game isn't over. It's just beginning. The first few days at Golden Meadows were a blur of forced smiles, saccharine platitudes from the staff, and the quiet, rustling sounds of old age, the shuffle of slippers, the rattle of pill cups, the murmur of televisions tuned to daytime game shows. I was polite, a model new resident on the surface. Yes, dear, the room is adequate. No, thank you, I don't believe I'll join the sit and be fit class this morning. The Jell-O is truly something. Inside, however, a cold, clear anger was beginning to solidify, chasing away the initial fog of shock and grief. This wasn't just about Caroline's betrayal. It was about my life, my autonomy, and I wasn't about to let them be snuffed out in a haze of lukewarm tea and condescending cheerfulness. My gilded cage, as I'd come to think of it, was small, but it had a window. It overlooked a meticulously kept rose garden, ironic given the thorns in my current situation. More importantly, it had a telephone, one of those old-fashioned beige ones bolted to the wall, presumably for safety. Caroline probably thought I'd use it to call her, weeping, begging to come home under her terms. Foolish girl, she always did underestimate her old mother. My first task was reconnaissance. I started observing. The staff, overworked, underpaid, most of them young enough to be my grandchildren, moved with a kind of weary efficiency. Some were genuinely kind, their eyes holding a flicker of compassion. Others were merely going through the motions, their smiles never quite reaching their eyes. I made a mental note of the kind ones. Allies, however unwitting, might be useful. The other residents, they were a mixed bag. Some, like me, seemed to have been deposited here against their will, their eyes holding a spark of defiance or a deep, simmering resentment. Others seemed resigned, lost in their memories or the flickering images on their television screens. A few even seemed content. Heaven help them, embracing the scheduled activities and the bland, predictable routine. I needed information. How did this place really operate? What were the rules, spoken and unspoken? And most importantly, what were Caroline and Michael up to with my house, my finances? Frank had always been meticulous about our affairs. He'd left everything in good order, a small but comfortable nest egg, the house fully paid off. I knew Caroline had been given power of attorney over my health decisions during my hip surgery, a temporary measure, I'd thought. Had she somehow used that, twisted it, to gain control over everything else? The thought made my blood run cold. My little beige telephone became my lifeline, my weapon. I started making calls. Discreetly, of course, usually in the quiet hours after dinner when the hallways were less busy and the staff were preoccupied. My first call was to Martha Henderson, Frank's old cousin, a retired legal secretary with a mind still as sharp as a tack. I didn't tell her everything, not yet. Just that I was in a rest facility for a while, and that I needed some advice about my affairs. "Agnes, darling," her voice crackled over the line. "I was wondering where you'd got to. Caroline said you were indisposed." Sounded fishy to me then. Sounds fishier now. What's that ungrateful chit done? Martha always had a way of cutting straight to the chase. I smiled, a genuine smile for the first time in days. I explained carefully about the power of attorney, about my concerns. Martha listened, interjecting with sharp, insightful questions. By the end of our conversation, I had a name. Mr. Abernathy, a lawyer she knew, an old-school bulldog who specialized in elder rights and wasn't afraid to take on a fight. Hope, a tiny, fragile seedling, began to unfurl in my chest. My next step was to understand my own financial situation. How much did Caroline actually control? I still had my checkbook for my small pension account, the one she hadn't managed to get her hands on yet. I called my bank. The conversation was an exercise in frustration, full of polite evasions and references to authorized signatories. But I gleaned one crucial piece of information. My main savings account, the one Frank and I had built, had seen a significant withdrawal a few weeks prior. Just before I was admitted here. Caroline's signature. The cold anger solidified into a diamond-hard resolve. She hadn't just put me away, she was systematically looting me. I'll show them all, I'd thought. It wasn't just a burst of defiance anymore. It was a promise. A battle plan was beginning to form in my mind, hazy at first, then clearer, sharper. This old burden wasn't going to go gentle into that good night. This old burden was going to fight. And Caroline, my darling, devious daughter, had no idea what was coming for her. Golden Meadows might be her idea of my final chapter, but for me, it was just the beginning of a whole new story. My story. And I would be the one to write the ending. The first week at Golden Meadows taught me one crucial lesson. This place, for all its pastel walls and forced cheerfulness, was a fortress designed to lull its inhabitants into a state of benign senility. My fight back wouldn't be a frontal assault. It would have to be a quiet, subversive campaign, waged from within these very walls. My mind, thank the good Lord, was still sharp, and Frank always said I had a stubborn streak a mile wide. Caroline was about to find out just how stubborn. My immediate priority was Mr. Abernathy, the lawyer Martha Henderson had recommended. Getting to a phone in private was the first challenge. The one in my room was an antique, probably monitored. The payphone in the main lobby was too public, but I'd noticed a little used sunroom at the far end of the west wing, often empty in the late afternoons, when most residents were either napping or being herded towards the sing-along with Sue activity. It had a dusty, forgotten telephone on a wicker table. Perfect. It took 2 days of careful observation to map out the staff routines and find my window of opportunity. On the third afternoon, feigning a sudden interest in the wilting ferns in the sunroom, I slipped away. My heart hammered against my ribs as I dialed the number Martha had given me, my fingers surprisingly steady. A crisp, no-nonsense voice answered on the third ring. Abernathy Law. May I speak to Mr. Horace Abernathy, please? I asked, keeping my voice low but firm. My name is Agnes Periwinkle. I was referred by Martha Henderson. There was a brief pause. One moment, please. Then a deeper, gravelly voice came on the line, a voice that sounded like it had seen its share of battles and wasn't afraid of a few more. Horace Abernathy speaking. Martha Henderson, you say? Known that old firecracker for 50 years. If she sent you, you must be in a real pickle, Mrs. Periwinkle. So tell me, what can I do for you? And so I told him. Everything. The fall, Caroline's sudden, suffocating concern, the manipulated doctors, the power of attorney I vaguely remembered signing when I was still muddled from pain medication after my hip surgery, the swift transfer to Golden Meadows, the glossy brochures, and the locked-away feeling. I told him about my house, Frank's legacy, and my suspicions about Caroline's access to my savings. I spoke for nearly 20 minutes, the words tumbling out, a torrent of grief, anger, and a desperate plea for help. Mr. Abernathy listened patiently, asking only a few sharp, clarifying questions. When I finally finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. For a terrifying moment, I thought he was going to dismiss me as just another confused old woman. Then he said, his voice resonating with a righteous indignation that made my heart leap with hope. Mrs. Periwinkle, what your daughter has allegedly done sounds not just unethical, but potentially illegal. Elder abuse, financial exploitation, fraudulent conveyance. These are serious charges. Now, proving them won't be easy, especially if she's got paperwork with your signature on it, however obtained. But it's not impossible, not by a long shot. He agreed to meet. Not here, not yet. He didn't want to alert Caroline. Instead, he suggested a way. He had a young associate, a bright woman named Miss Diaz, who did pro bono work and sometimes visited her own grandmother at a facility not far from Golden Meadows. He proposed that Miss Diaz could visit me here, perhaps under the guise of a volunteer or a distant relative, to gather more information and for me to sign the necessary papers to retain him. We need to move carefully, Agnes, he warned, his use of my first name a small, comforting familiarity. Your daughter and her husband, if they're as determined as you say, will have tried to cover their tracks. But people like that, they always get greedy. They always make mistakes. Hope, it was a dangerous, intoxicating thing. After I hung up, I sat there in that dusty sunroom for a long time, the conversation replaying in my mind. I wasn't alone anymore. I had an ally, a bulldog. My next few days were spent in a state of heightened awareness. I observed Caroline more closely during her brief, perfunctory visits. She was all smiles and concern on the surface, asking about my activities, if I was making friends. Oh, it's lovely, dear, I'd say, my own smile just as false as hers. The watercolor class is inspiring, and the people are so quiet. Her eyes would narrow slightly, searching for any sign of rebellion, but I gave her none. I was the picture of a contented, slightly dazed old lady, settling into her golden years. Inside, however, the general of a one-woman army was planning her campaign. I started talking more to some of the other residents, particularly those who seemed as unimpressed with Golden Meadows as I was. There was Mrs. Albright, a sharp-tongued former librarian in a wheelchair, who claimed her son had warehoused her here to get his hands on her antique collection. And Mr. Henderson, no relation to my Martha Henderson, just a coincidence of good, honest names it seemed, a retired history teacher whose children lived overseas and rarely visited, leaving him to the mercies of the system after a stroke. We formed a small, unofficial complaints department in the corner of the dreary common room during the lull after lunch. We didn't speak of outright rebellion, not yet. But we shared stories, observations, small acts of defiance, like hiding the remote control for the TV when the overly cheerful activities director, Brenda, wanted to put on another mind-numbing sing-along. Ms. Diaz, Mr. Abernathy's associate, arrived the following week. She was young, barely 30, with bright, intelligent eyes and a handshake that was firm and reassuring. She came during visiting hours, introduced herself as a niece of an old college friend, a story I'd prearranged with Martha Henderson to tell the front desk if anyone asked. We sat in my small room, the door slightly ajar as per the rules, and I told her everything again, this time with more detail, more documents, or rather, the lack thereof, as Caroline had taken most of my important papers. Miss Diaz listened intently, taking copious notes, her expression growing more serious with each revelation. Your daughter obtained a durable power of attorney while you were recovering from hip surgery, you said? She asked, her pen hovering over her notepad. Do you remember the circumstances clearly? Were you on strong medication? Muddled, I said. Very muddled, it all happened so fast. She said it was just for medical decisions, in case I couldn't speak for myself. Ms. Diaz nodded. That's a common tactic. We'll need to subpoena those records, and the records from your bank. Mr. Abernathy is already drafting the preliminary injunction to try and freeze any further transactions on your accounts, and prevent the sale of your house, if it hasn't been sold already. My house. The thought of it being sold, of strangers living in Frank's rooms, sent a fresh wave of pain through me. Can we stop her? I whispered. We're going to do our damnedest, Mrs. Periwinkle, Miss Diaz said, her voice full of a conviction that warmed me. You have rights. And Mr. Abernathy? Well, he doesn't like bullies, especially bullies who prey on the elderly. Before she left, I signed the papers making Horace Abernathy my legal representative. As her hand touched mine, I felt a surge of something I hadn't felt in months, a fighting chance. The fight, I knew, was just beginning. Caroline wouldn't give up easily. She had too much to lose now. But so did I. I had my home, my dignity, and the memory of Frank to fight for. And I had allies. A bulldog lawyer, a sharp young associate, and a couple of disgruntled old folks in a retirement home who knew a thing or two about being underestimated. Golden Meadows. They thought it was my final resting place. They were about to find out it was my boot camp. The days following Miss Diaz's visit were filled with a strange mixture of anxiety and a burgeoning, unfamiliar excitement. I was no longer just a forgotten old woman languishing in a pastel prison. I was a plaintiff, a fighter, a woman with a bulldog lawyer sharpening his teeth on my behalf. I still had to play the part of the docile resident, of course. I attended the dreadful craft corner, where we mostly just tangled yarn and gossiped. I ate the bland, overcooked vegetables without complaint, and I even managed a weak smile for Brenda, the relentlessly cheerful activities director, when she tried to coax me into a game of balloon volleyball. Maybe next time, dear, I'd say. My hip is still a little tender. Inside, though, I was a flurry of activity. Mr. Abernathy had given Miss Diaz a list of things I should try to recall or find, if possible. Dates of conversations with Caroline about finances, any scraps of paperwork I might still have tucked away in my suitcase, names of bank officials I might have spoken to. My little room, once a symbol of my confinement, became my war room. I'd sit by the window, pretending to watch the roses, but really, I was sifting through memories, piecing together the timeline of Caroline's betrayal, my mind sharper and more focused than it had been in years. My newfound purpose didn't go entirely unnoticed. Mrs. Albright, the former librarian with the sharp tongue and even sharper eyes, cornered me in the hallway one afternoon. Agnes Periwinkle, she said, her voice a conspiratorial whisper, though her gaze was direct. You've got a spark about you these days I haven't seen before. You're up to something, aren't you? I hesitated. Could I trust her? Frank always said I was too quick to see the good in people. But there was something in Mrs. Albright's eyes. A kindred spirit, perhaps. Another woman who wouldn't go down without a fight. "Let's just say," I murmured, a small smile playing on my lips, "that Golden Meadows might be in for a bit of a surprise." She cackled, a dry, papery sound. "Well, count me in if you need a lookout or someone to create a diversion during bingo. I've been looking for some excitement." A week later, Caroline announced she was coming for a visit. "Just to see how you're settling in, Mama," she chirped over the phone, her voice dripping with that false sweetness that now set my teeth on edge. "And Michael wants to say hello. He's worried about you. Worried I might be enjoying myself too much, more like. Or worried I might be causing trouble." I braced myself for the encounter. This would be the first time I'd seen her since I'd retained Mr. Abernathy. I had to be careful to give nothing away. She arrived with Michael in tow, bearing a cellophane-wrapped basket of anemic-looking fruit and a patronizing smile. "Mama, you look—" "Well," she said, her eyes scanning my room, probably checking for signs of mental decline or undue contentment. "I'm managing, dear," I said, my voice carefully neutral. "The Jell-O is still an adventure." Michael hovered awkwardly by the door, looking even more spineless than usual. Caroline launched into a monologue about her busy schedule, the children's latest achievements, which I noted no longer seemed to include any desire to visit their grandmother, and how much better I seemed now that I was getting proper care. I listened, nodding, making non-committal sounds, all the while observing her. The expensive new handbag she carried. The subtle, almost smug set of her jaw. She was already spending my money, I was sure of it. The anger I'd been carefully banking flared, but I kept my expression placid. "And the house, Mama," she said, her voice taking on a businesslike tone. "Michael and I have been looking into getting it cleaned out and appraised. It really needs a lot of work before we can decide what's best to do with it." "Decide what's best?" "Meaning sell it and pocket the proceeds." "That's thoughtful of you, dear," I said, my voice dangerously sweet. "But perhaps you should hold off on that for a little while. There might be other considerations." Her eyes narrowed. "Other considerations, Mama? What do you mean?" "Oh, just some old papers Frank left," I said vaguely, waving a dismissive hand. "Legal things. My lawyer is looking into them. Just routine, I'm sure." Lawyer. The word hung in the air between us. I saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Surprise? Annoyance? Fear? It was gone in an instant, replaced by her usual smooth composure. But I'd seen it. "A lawyer, Mama?" she said, her voice a little too bright. "Whatever for? You know I'm handling all your affairs." "Just tying up loose ends, dear," I said, giving her my most innocent, slightly confused old lady smile. "You know how important it is to have things in order." She didn't press further, but the atmosphere in the room had changed. It was charged, tense. Her visit was shorter than usual. As she was leaving, she paused at the door. "You seem different, Mama." "Do I, dear?" I said. "Must be the stimulating environment here at Golden Meadows. All this rest is doing me a world of good." The look she gave me was sharp, appraising. She knew something was up. Good. Let her wonder. Let her worry. The day after her visit, Mr. Abernathy called. Not on the sunroom phone this time, but through a message relayed by a sympathetic young nurse, one of the kind ones I'd noted, who slipped me a note to call him from the payphone at a specific time. "Agnes." His voice was grim when I finally got through. "We've got the bank records, and Caroline has been busy. Very busy. She's transferred a significant amount of your savings into an account solely in her name. And there's a preliminary sales agreement for your house already drawn up, set to close in 2 weeks." My blood ran cold. 2 weeks. "But," he continued, and I could almost hear the bulldog growl in his voice, "we also filed the injunction. The judge has granted a temporary restraining order on all your assets, including the sale of the house, pending a full hearing. We've stopped her, Agnes, for now. Relief, so potent it made me sway, washed over me. Stopped her, for now. The hearing is set for next month, Mr. Abernathy said. It's going to be a fight. She'll claim incompetence, that you're not fit to manage your affairs. We need to be ready. Ready? I was more than ready. I was just getting started. Caroline thought she'd locked me away to wither. She had no idea she'd just given me a cause, a battlefield, and a reason to show them all exactly what this old burden was made of. The month leading up to the hearing was the longest, most nerve-wracking month of my life. Longer even than those first agonizing weeks after Frank passed, or the terrifying uncertainty when Marcus had that bout of pneumonia as a child. This was different. This was a fight not against sickness or fate, but against my own flesh and blood, for the right to simply be myself, to live out my remaining years with dignity in my own home. The thought of facing Caroline in court, of laying bare the ugliness of her betrayal before a judge and strangers, filled me with a potent cocktail of dread and a grim, simmering determination. Mr. Abernathy and Miss Diaz were wonderful. They treated me not as a frail old dear, but as a client, a partner in this fight. Miss Diaz visited me several times at Golden Meadows, always under some plausible guise. A distant cousin interested in my family history, a volunteer, helping with residence correspondence. We'd huddle in my small room, or sometimes, daringly, in the little used sunroom, going over details, dates, Caroline's exact words, her increasingly frequent requests for money in the years leading up to my decline. Every detail matters, Agnes, Mr. Abernathy had told me over the phone, his voice a reassuring growl. We need to paint a clear picture of a competent, independent woman who was systematically manipulated and exploited by her own daughter. The power of attorney she wields, we need to show it was obtained under duress or when you weren't fully capable of understanding its implications. Recalling those moments was like picking at a barely healed wound. The conversations with Caroline where she'd sighed about her financial troubles, Michael's latest bad investment, the children's expensive school fees. My own foolish maternal urge to help, to ease her burdens, even when it meant dipping into the savings Frank and I had earmarked for our own old age, for emergencies. And then, the papers I'd signed after my hip surgery, when I was still woozy and disoriented. Caroline's voice a soothing murmur, assuring me it was just to help with the hospital bills, Mama, so you don't have to worry. Liar. The staff at Golden Meadows became trickier. After Caroline's last visit, where I'd dropped my little bombshell about having a lawyer, there was a subtle shift. Brenda, the activities director, became almost aggressively cheerful, constantly trying to involve me in stimulating group activities that I had no interest in. Nurse Ratched, well, that wasn't her real name, but it's what Mrs. Albright and I called the stern head nurse with the perpetually pursed lips, started making more frequent, unscheduled checks on me, asking pointed questions about my mood and memory. I knew Caroline was behind it, trying to gather evidence of my supposed incompetence. My little band of allies, Mrs. Albright and Mr. Henderson, became invaluable. Mrs. Albright, with her librarian's knack for observation, would keep an eye on Nurse Ratched's movements and create diversions when Miss Diaz needed to slip in or out. Mr. Henderson, bless his quiet soul, would engage me in long, detailed discussions about World War II history whenever he saw staff members hovering too close during my phone calls, his booming voice effectively masking my own hushed conversations. They were small acts of rebellion, but they meant the world to me. They reminded me I wasn't entirely alone in this pastel prison. The day of the hearing dawned gray and drizzly, mirroring my own apprehensive mood. Ms. Diaz arrived early to pick me up. I'd insisted on wearing my best dress, the navy blue one Frank had always liked, and the small string of pearls he'd given me on our 30th anniversary. If I was going into battle, I was going to do it with my head held high. The courthouse was an imposing, cold building. Mr. Abernathy met us at the entrance, his presence a solid, reassuring bulwark. He squeezed my arm gently. "You ready for this, Agnes?" "As I'll ever be, Horace," I said, trying for a brave smile. The courtroom was smaller than I'd imagined, but no less intimidating. Caroline was already there, sitting beside her lawyer, a sleek, expensive-looking man whose smile didn't reach his eyes. Michael, her husband, sat behind them, looking pale and uncomfortable, pointedly avoiding my gaze. When Caroline's eyes met mine, there was no flicker of warmth, no hint of regret. Only a cold, hard determination that chilled me to the bone. This was my daughter, the baby I had nursed, the girl whose tears I had wiped away, and she was looking at me as if I were a stranger, an obstacle. The hearing began. Caroline's lawyer painted a picture of a loving, concerned daughter, forced to take difficult steps to protect her confused and increasingly frail mother from her own inability to manage her affairs. He presented affidavits from doctors, including the one who'd seen me for 15 minutes, attesting to my cognitive decline and vulnerability. He spoke of my isolation and eccentric behavior, which I suspected referred to my refusal to participate in balloon volleyball. It was a masterful performance, full of carefully chosen words and sympathetic tones, designed to portray me as a pathetic, incapable old woman. I felt a flush of anger, but Mr. Abernathy's calming hand on my arm kept me silent. Then it was Mr. Abernathy's turn. He was magnificent. He systematically dismantled their arguments, his voice a low, powerful rumble, his questions sharp and incisive. He presented my bank records, showing the pattern of withdrawals by Caroline. He questioned the validity of the power of attorney, highlighting the circumstances under which I'd signed it. He even had a surprise witness, Clara, Mrs. Henderson's daughter, my kind neighbor from Elm Street, who testified to my lucidity and independence in the weeks before Caroline had swooped in. Clara spoke of our regular chats, my ability to manage my home, my garden, my finances. She painted a picture of a vibrant, engaged woman, not the confused recluse Caroline's lawyer had described. Finally, the judge, a stern-faced woman named Judge Harrison, turned to me. "Mrs. Periwinkle," she said, her gaze surprisingly kind. "Do you wish to address the court?" This was it. My chance. My voice trembled as I stood, but I clutched the edge of the witness stand for support, and looked directly at the judge, then, briefly, at Caroline. "Your Honor," I began, my voice gaining strength as I spoke. "I am an old woman, yes. I recently broke my hip, and it slowed me down, as it would anyone my age. But I am not senile. I am not incompetent. And I am not a burden to be discarded." I spoke of my life with Frank, of our home, of my love for my daughter, and the pain of her betrayal. I didn't raise my voice, didn't resort to accusations. I simply told my truth, my voice clear and steady. I spoke of my desire to live out my days in my own home, surrounded by my memories, managing my own affairs, as I had always done. "My daughter says she's doing this for my own good, for my safety," I concluded, my gaze finding Caroline's again. "But taking away a person's home, their independence, their dignity, that is not an act of love, Your Honor. That is an act of cruelty. I am asking this court to restore my rights, to let me go home." When I finished, a profound silence filled the courtroom. Judge Harrison looked at me for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she looked at Caroline, whose face was a mask of stony indifference. The judge shuffled her papers. "This court has heard compelling testimony from both sides," she said finally. "The issue of elder well-being versus an individual's autonomy is always a delicate balance." She paused, and my heart pounded in my chest. "However, based on the evidence presented today, and on Mrs. Periwinkle's own clear and coherent testimony, this court finds." Judge Harrison paused, and in that stretched-out second, I swear I could hear the frantic thumping of my own heart above the courtroom's hushed anticipation. Caroline sat ramrod straight, her face a carefully constructed mask of concerned composure, but I saw the slight tremor in her hands as she clutched her expensive handbag. Michael, beside her, looked like he was about to be physically ill. "This court finds," Judge Harrison continued, her voice firm and clear, cutting through the tension, "that Mrs. Agnes Periwinkle is, indeed, competent and fully capable of managing her own personal and financial affairs. The durable power of attorney granted to Mrs. Caroline Sterling is hereby revoked. The temporary restraining order on Mrs. Periwinkle's assets will be made permanent against unauthorized access by Mrs. Sterling and her husband. Mrs. Periwinkle is free to reside where she chooses, including her own home on Elm Street, effective immediately. The petition to have her declared a ward of the court, or to mandate her residence in an assisted living facility is denied. Denied. Revoked. Free to reside where she chooses. Effective immediately." The words washed over me, each one a balm to my wounded spirit. I felt Miss Diaz's hand squeeze mine under the table. I looked at Mr. Abernathy, a slow, satisfied smile, the smile of a bulldog who'd just sunk his teeth into a particularly juicy bone, spread across his face. I turned my gaze to Caroline. Her mask had shattered. Her face was a mottled canvas of disbelief, fury, and something that looked shockingly like fear. Her mouth opened, then closed again, no sound emerging. Michael just slumped further in his chair, his eyes wide and vacant. A wave of dizziness, this time born not of despair but of overwhelming relief, made me grip the edge of the witness stand. I had won. This old burden, this supposedly frail and confused woman, had faced her accusers, and had won. The tears that came then were not tears of sorrow, but of a fierce, triumphant joy, mixed with the bitter tang of what it had cost me to get to this point. "Court is adjourned," Judge Harrison said, her gavel coming down with a decisive crack that echoed the breaking of my chains. The aftermath was a whirlwind. Mr. Abernathy and Miss Diaz were jubilant, shaking my hand, their faces beaming. Clara, my dear neighbor, who had waited anxiously in the back of the courtroom, rushed forward to hug me, her own eyes wet. "I knew you could do it, Agnes," she whispered. "I knew it." Caroline and Michael, along with their sleek lawyer, practically fled the courtroom, their retreat undignified and swift. Caroline didn't even glance in my direction. The daughter who had professed such deep concern for my well-being couldn't even face me in my moment of vindication. That, perhaps, hurt more than all her carefully constructed lies. Leaving Golden Meadows was an experience I will savor for the rest of my days. Miss Diaz and Mr. Abernathy insisted on escorting me. When I walked out of that beige room for the last time, carrying my small, battered suitcase, I felt like a prisoner tasting freedom after a long, unjust sentence. Nurse Ratched watched me go, her lips pursed even tighter than usual, a silent testament to her disapproval. I gave her my sweetest, most serene smile. Even Brenda, the activities director, looked momentarily stunned into silence when I breezed past her attempted invitation to a farewell sing-along. "No, thank you, dear," I said, my voice light. "I have a real life to get back to. My little house on Elm Street." Oh, the joy of walking back through that familiar front door. It was dusty, yes, and a little neglected from weeks of Caroline's management, or lack thereof, but it was mine. The scent of Frank's old books, the roses peeking through the kitchen window, the comfortable sag of my favorite armchair, it all welcomed me home like a long-lost friend. Clara helped me air the place out, her cheerful chatter a welcome antidote to the hushed, oppressive atmosphere of Golden Meadows. The fight wasn't entirely over, of course. Mr. Abernathy warned me there would be legal wrangling ahead to fully untangle the financial mess Caroline had created, to try and recover the money she had already taken. "She won't make it easy, Agnes," he'd said. "People like that rarely do." I knew he was right. But for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I wasn't afraid. I had faced my daughter in court and won. I had reclaimed my home, my independence, my dignity. The old burden had indeed shown them. And as I sat in my own kitchen that evening, a cup of real tea in my hand, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of rose and gold through my own clean window, I knew this was more than just a victory. It was a resurrection. My resurrection. And Caroline, wherever she was, whatever she was planning next, was about to find out that Agnes Periwinkle was far from finished. My story was far from over. Returning to my little house on Elm Street was like stepping back into my own skin after being forced to wear a stranger's ill-fitting clothes for too long. The initial euphoria of freedom, however, soon gave way to the stark realization that winning one battle didn't mean the war was over. Caroline, my ambitious, avaricious daughter, was not the type to accept defeat gracefully. I knew, with a certainty that settled like a cold stone in my stomach, that she would be back, in one form or another. Mr. Abernathy had warned me as much. She's lost control of your person and the direct access to your main assets for now, Agnes, he'd said, his voice kind but firm, the day after the hearing. But she still knows about your savings, the house. She'll be looking for loopholes, ways to challenge your competency again, or to wear you down. We need to be proactive. Proactive. That was a word I was beginning to embrace. For too many years, I'd been reactive, always responding to David's crises in my first marriage, and then, in a different way, to Caroline's subtle manipulations. No more. The old Agnes, the one who would sigh and give in for the sake of peace, was still there, a part of me. But a new Agnes was emerging, one forged in the fires of betrayal and the cold halls of Golden Meadows. This Agnes had a bulldog lawyer and a taste for fighting for what was hers. The first order of business was to secure my finances. Mr. Abernathy and Miss Diaz worked diligently, untangling the mess Caroline had made. It turned out my daughter had indeed been systematically siphoning funds from my savings account for months, justifying them as expenses for Mama's care or preparations for her future needs. Future needs that apparently included a new designer wardrobe for Caroline and a down payment on a luxury SUV for Michael, if the credit card statements Ms. Diaz managed to unearth were any indication. The sheer audacity of it still took my breath away. We changed all my bank accounts, established new security protocols, and Mr. Abernathy began the painstaking process of trying to claw back what had been wrongfully taken. He also drew up a new ironclad will for me, one that made very specific provisions and, needless to say, did not feature Caroline as a primary beneficiary. That task, signing that new will, felt like closing a heavy door on a painful chapter of my life. Life in my little house slowly began to find its rhythm again, though it was a new rhythm, one tinged with caution and a lingering sadness. Clara, my dear neighbor, was a constant source of support, bringing over casseroles, these ones I actually wanted, helping me in the garden, or just sitting with me on the porch swing, talking about everything and nothing. Mrs. Albright, my sharp-witted friend from Golden Meadows, who was now, with Mr. Abernathy's help, starting her own battle against her grasping son, would call me regularly, her acerbic wit a welcome tonic. "Don't let that viper of a daughter get you down, Agnes," she'd cackle. "Show her what us old broads are made of." Caroline did try, of course. About a month after the hearing, she appeared on my doorstep, her face a carefully arranged mask of contrition, a bouquet of overly expensive lilies in her hand. "Mama," she began, her voice trembling with expertly feigned emotion. I've been doing a lot of thinking. I was wrong. I was so worried about you, I overstepped. Can you ever forgive me?" I looked at her, at the daughter I had loved, the daughter who had so callously betrayed me. The old Agnes would have wept, would have opened her arms, desperate for reconciliation. But the new Agnes, the one who had stared down a judge and reclaimed her life, just looked at her coolly, Forgiveness is a complicated thing, Caroline, I said, my voice even. Perhaps you can start by returning the money you borrowed from my savings account, and by explaining to Mr. Abernathy why you felt my house needed to be sold so urgently when I was perfectly capable of living in it. The mask slipped. A flicker of her true cold anger flashed in her eyes before she could control it. I see you're still unwell, Mama, she said, her voice hardening. Still being influenced by that shyster lawyer. My lawyer, Caroline, I corrected her gently, is helping me protect myself from those who would take advantage of an old burden. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have things to do. And I closed the door in her perfectly made-up, astonished face. It wasn't a grand gesture of showing them all, not yet, but it was a start. A small, satisfying click of a door on a path I was now choosing for myself. The real showing them, however, came a few weeks later. Mr. Abernathy had, through his meticulous work, managed to freeze a significant portion of the funds Caroline had moved, and had also uncovered details about her and Michael's rather precarious financial situation. They were living far beyond their means, propped up by loans and, it seemed, my stolen savings. One of the properties Frank and I had invested in decades ago, a small commercial building in a part of town that was now undergoing a renaissance, had become quite valuable. Caroline had been eyeing it, Mr. Abernathy discovered, planning to use it as collateral for yet another of Michael's harebrained business schemes. With Mr. Abernathy's guidance, I made a decision. I wasn't a businesswoman, Frank had always handled that side of things. But I knew what was right. I decided to sell that building. And the proceeds, a not inconsiderable sum, were not going into a savings account Caroline could ever hope to touch. I established a small foundation in Frank's name. The Frank Periwinkle Foundation for Elder Advocacy and Support. Its mission, to provide legal aid and support for elderly individuals facing situations like mine, those at risk of exploitation, those whose voices were being silenced. Mr. Abernathy agreed to be on the board, pro bono. Martha Henderson, with her legal background, was thrilled to join. Even Mrs. Albright, from her room at Golden Meadows, which she was now determined to leave with our help, offered her services as a remote researcher and chief instigator of righteous indignation, as she put it. The day the foundation was officially announced, with a small piece in the local paper, was a quiet day for me. But I knew Caroline would see it. I knew she would understand. The money she had coveted, the assets she had tried to steal, were now being used to fight against people exactly like her. That, I thought with a grim satisfaction, was a way of showing them all, that resonated far beyond just my own personal victory. It was turning my pain into purpose. My life wasn't suddenly easy or free of sorrow. The wound Caroline had inflicted was deep, and the loss of a daughter's love, or at least the illusion of it, was a grief that would likely stay with me. But I was no longer a victim. I was Agnes Periwinkle, a survivor, a fighter, and now, perhaps, a quiet force for good. And as I sat on my porch swing, watching the roses Frank had planted bloom with a defiant beauty, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't thought possible. The game was indeed still on, but now I was setting some of the rules. The Frank Periwinkle Foundation for Elder Advocacy and Support wasn't just a name on a piece of paper. It became my new purpose, my quiet, dignified answer to Caroline's cruelty. The small announcement in the Macon Telegraph was discreet, but I knew Caroline would see it. I could almost picture her face, tight with fury and disbelief, when she realized that the money she'd been so desperate to control was now actively working against the very tactics she and others like her employed. There was a certain grim poetry in that, a justice Frank himself would have appreciated with his quiet, wry humor. Mr. Abernathy handled the legalities of the foundation with his usual bulldog tenacity, ensuring it was ironclad and managed by a responsible board, himself, Martha Henderson, a retired judge Martha knew, and myself as honorary chair. Ms. Diaz, his bright young associate, volunteered her time to help with initial casework, her youthful idealism a refreshing counterpoint to my own weary cynicism about human nature. A cynicism Caroline had worked so hard to instill. The first few cases the foundation took on were heartbreaking, echoing my own experiences in too many ways. An elderly man whose son was trying to sell his farm out from under him. A woman whose pension was being siphoned off by a concerned niece. Another resident from a different Golden Meadows type facility who was being over-medicated into a stupor. Each small victory Mr. Abernathy and Miss Diaz achieved on their behalf felt like a personal triumph for me, a way of reclaiming not just my own dignity, but the dignity of so many others who were too often voiceless and vulnerable. It was a different kind of showing them all, not a shout of anger, but a quiet, determined building of something good and strong from the rubble of betrayal. Caroline, as expected, did not take this well. There were no more visits, no more saccharine phone calls. Instead, there were letters from her lawyer, full of veiled threats and accusations, challenging my competency yet again, questioning the undue influence of Mr. Abernathy, hinting at further legal action to contest my decisions regarding family assets. "Let her try," Mr. Abernathy had rumbled when I showed him the latest missive. "She's flailing, Agnes. She knows she's lost the moral high ground, and now she's losing the financial one too. We'll counter every move she makes." And they did. The legal skirmishes continued, a low, rumbling background noise to my new life, but they no longer held the same terror for me. I had good people on my side, and more importantly, I had rediscovered my own strength, a resilience I'd forgotten I possessed. My days settled into a new routine. I worked with Martha Henderson on the Foundation's correspondence, my old secretarial skills proving surprisingly useful. I tended Frank's roses, their familiar scent a daily comfort. I even started attending the occasional quilting circle at Harmony Baptist again, the gentle chatter of the ladies a welcome balm. They knew, of course, in the way small communities always know, that there had been trouble with Caroline, but they treated me with kindness and respect, never prying, just offering a quiet, steady friendship. Mrs. Albright from Golden Meadows would call with updates on her own fight, her voice full of a new, feisty determination. "That Abernathy's a miracle worker, Agnes," she'd declare. "My son's actually looking scared for the first time in his life. We showed him, didn't we?" "We're showing them, Eleanor," I'd correct her gently. "The fight isn't over yet." And it wasn't. The final disposition of the funds Caroline had taken was still tied up in legal proceedings. My relationship with my only daughter was in ruins, a gaping wound that I wasn't sure would ever truly heal. There were nights when the loneliness would creep in, when I'd miss Frank so acutely it was a physical pain, when the enormity of Caroline's betrayal would wash over me anew. But now there was a difference. The despair no longer consumed me. The anger no longer felt like a destructive fire, but a focused energy, channeled into the foundation, into helping others. I was no longer just Agnes Periwinkle, the discarded old burden. I was Agnes Periwinkle, survivor, advocate, and a woman who was, in her own quiet way, indeed showing them all. Showing them that age did not mean irrelevance, that vulnerability did not mean defeat, and that the human spirit, even when bent, could refuse to be broken. My little house on Elm Street was no longer just a refuge, it was a command center, my home, my fortress. And I was its queen, a queen who had weathered a terrible storm, and was now, slowly but surely, rebuilding her kingdom, one rosebush, one legal brief, one act of quiet defiance at a time. Carolyn had tried to write the final chapter of my life for me, a sad tale of decline and surrender in a place called Golden Meadows. She had no idea I was busy writing an entirely different ending, one filled with purpose, strength, and the quiet, enduring power of a life reclaimed. The years that followed my return to Elm Street were not without their shadows, but they were undeniably mine. The legal battles with Caroline rumbled on for what felt like an eternity, a slow, grinding process of depositions, account trackings, and unpleasant letters between lawyers. Mr. Abernathy, true to his bulldog nature, pursued every last cent Caroline had misappropriated with a relentless tenacity that often left me breathless with gratitude. He shielded me from the worst of it, but the updates he provided were a constant reminder of the depth of my daughter's avarice and deceit. It turned out Caroline and Michael were in even deeper financial trouble than we'd initially suspected. My savings had been a desperate, last-ditch attempt to keep their house of cards from collapsing. When those funds were frozen and then, bit by bit, recovered through legal action, their carefully constructed world began to unravel. They lost their fancy SUV first, then their over-mortgaged McMansion in the suburbs. Michael's business ventures, always built on shaky foundations and other people's money, evaporated one by one. I heard through the grapevine, the small-town telegraph that still hummed efficiently even in this modern age, that their marriage was strained, their social standing in tatters. There was a grim, undeniable satisfaction in this. I won't lie. Not a malicious joy, but the quiet affirmation that actions indeed have consequences. Caroline had sown the wind, and now she was reaping the whirlwind. She had tried to declare me a burden, incompetent, to strip me of everything. Instead, she had stripped herself bare, revealing the emptiness at the core of her own life. The Frank Periwinkle Foundation became my heart and soul. It grew, slowly at first, then with more confidence as word spread. We helped dozens of elderly folks navigate the treacherous waters of predatory relatives, confusing legal systems, and the loneliness that so often accompanies old age and vulnerability. Ms. Diaz became a permanent fixture, her youthful energy and sharp legal mind a driving force. Mrs. Albright, having won her own battle and escaped her version of Golden Meadows, with a hefty settlement she gleefully donated a portion of to our foundation, became our most outspoken advocate and a surprisingly effective fundraiser. Even Mr. Henderson, the quiet history teacher, found his voice, helping to organize workshops on elder rights. My little house on Elm Street, once a symbol of my impending doom, became a place of warmth, strategy, and quiet triumphs. The dining room table was often covered in paperwork. The phone rang with calls from clients or volunteers, and the scent of coffee and determination filled the air. I was busy. I was purposeful. I was, for the first time in a long, long while, truly happy in a way that felt earned, solid. The final legal victory came nearly 2 years after that fateful day in court. Most of my money was recovered, though some had been irretrievably lost to Caroline and Michael's creditors. But it was enough. More than enough. The house was secure, my future was secure, and the foundation had a solid financial footing to continue its work long after I was gone. Mr. Abernathy called me with the news. "We got her, Agnes," he said, a note of triumph in his gravelly voice. "She won't be bothering you again anytime soon. And her reputation? Well, let's just say it's in tatters." That evening, Caroline called me. It was the first time I'd heard her voice in nearly 2 years, apart from the cold, formal exchanges through lawyers. Her tone was different now. Gone was the false sweetness, the condescending concern. It was replaced by a ragged, desperate edge. "Mama?" she said, her voice small, almost broken. I heard about the final settlement. They took everything Michael and I had left." I was silent for a long moment, listening to the sound of her strained breathing. There was no apology in her voice, not really. Just a raw statement of her own misfortune. "The foundation is doing good work, Caroline," I said finally, my voice calm, devoid of the anger that had once consumed me. "It's helping people who found themselves in situations much like the one you tried to put me in." Another silence. Then, "Mama, I don't know what to do. We have nothing." Was this it? Was this her attempt at reconciliation? Or just another ploy, another angle? I searched my heart. The old instinctive maternal urge to soothe, to fix, was still there, a faint echo. But it was overlaid now with a hard-won wisdom, a clarity I hadn't possessed before. "You'll have to figure it out, Caroline," I said, not unkindly but firmly. "Just like I had to figure it out when you left me with nothing. It's called consequences. It's called growing up, even if you're well into middle age." I could hear her sharp intake of breath. Perhaps she'd expected me to offer money, to bail her out one last time? "I wish you no ill, Caroline," I continued. "For your sake, I hope you learn something from all this. I hope you find a way to build a life based on something real, not on deceit and greed. But my path, and the path of Frank's legacy, is clear now. It does not include funding your mistakes any longer." I didn't wait for her reply. I said a quiet, "Goodbye, Caroline," and gently hung up the phone. There was no triumph in that moment, no surge of vindictive pleasure. Just a profound sadness, a sense of an ending, a necessary ending. I had loved my daughter, and a part of me always would. But I could no longer allow her to destroy me, or to tarnish the good I was now trying to do in the world. The following spring, Frank's roses bloomed with an almost defiant exuberance, their scent filling my small garden. I sat on my porch swing, a cup of tea in my hand, watching the bees hum amongst the blossoms. The foundation was thriving. We'd helped reunite a grandmother with her grandchildren after her son had tried to isolate her. We'd stopped a predatory conservatorship from stripping an old veteran of his home. Each success was a quiet affirmation. I wasn't a burden, I wasn't too old. I wasn't irrelevant. I had faced betrayal, loss, and the terrifying prospect of a desolate end. And I had not only survived, I had found a new beginning. I had shown them all, Caroline, Michael, the indifferent world, and perhaps most importantly myself, what Agnes Periwinkle was truly made of. My life was my own again, filled with purpose, with friendship, with the quiet satisfaction of making a difference. The anger had faded, replaced by a deep, abiding peace. The scars were still there, a reminder of the battle fought and won, but they no longer ached. They were simply a part of my story, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, and the enduring power of a life lived with dignity, on one's own terms. And that, I thought with a slow, contented smile, was the best kind of showing them all there was.